I became so competent at providing physical courage, that it just wasn't ever something that came into consideration. We're just great at doing what needed to be done, putting ourselves in danger doing all that, whereas life outside of service really ever requires physical courage, and that's where we really find ourselves in a place where we don't feel relevant. But what we actually have is the flip side of that, which is moral courage, because we actually have the basic building blocks of personal ethos and values that have led us to absolute greatness that has caused us to not even fear for our own lives. And that's perspective and experience that some people are never going to have. And it's harnessing that as responsibility to then apply that to really appreciating what matters in life and doing the right thing. Moral courage, you're not going to get killed for it, but still it's one of the hardest things to do. And that's the best way we can lead by example, is just being the best that we can be for the right reasons.
Hey guys, welcome to today's episode of the Live, Train, Perform podcast. I'm your host, Sean Kober, and joining me today is Heston Russell, who is a retired Special Forces commander and who is now the owner, founder of Voice of a Veteran. Heston, welcome to the podcast, mate. How are you?
Good, Cobes. Thanks for having me, mate.
My pleasure, mate. I'm excited to have a chat to you. We haven't actually met, but we've been kind of following each other.
It's been a long
on
distance,
social media,
hasn't it?
Yeah. We've been following each other a little bit on social media for the last 6 months, 8 months or something like that. And, there's so many things that I want to talk to you about in this conversation, because you've got so much going on in your life. I've been listening to you and Scotty Evernet's podcast, Voice of a Veteran, as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of want to discuss that. I want to discuss the direction that you're heading in with Voice of a Veteran, why you've started that, and kind of something that's been big in the news recently has been the Brereton report. How have you seen that unfold, and how's that impacting veterans back home?
So quickly putting all those things together, mate, my story was service, transition, start of 2019, but before that, long service, and got to a point, basically August last year, August 2020, where I seriously sat down and thought about taking my own life, and then had my aha moment, went back and did some backcasting and sort of tracked and traced the ways and means that I had got to that place in my own actions and attitude, but also those within some really key systemic failures, from the lack of transition process in the ADF through to literally the only problem that I'm yet to be able to not solve, and that's trying to get my own admin through the Department of Veterans Affairs. So that all happened, and I jumped into the media and founded Voice of a Veteran because I needed something that wasn't me putting myself forward, it was putting a cause forward. And then, that was sort of October. Then a month later, that was September. Then a month later in October, the ABC published a story that was a US Marine, Huey door gunner, heard a pop in Afghanistan in 2012 and said that November Platoon, of which I was the platoon commander, November Platoon, Afghan 2012, allegedly executed someone to fit them on a helicopter because he heard a pop. And I just took to social media and just said, 1, this is such crap. 2, I was the platoon commander. Let's have a chat. Long story short, the project ended as well, but the project jumped onto the social media stuff and invited me in to do a one-on-one interview with them, of which I got to tell my side of the story, particularly in the context of just how much our community has been hurting with mental health and the ongoing Brereton report, which had been 4.5 years in the making. And then a month later, the Brereton report was released, and I was sort of top of mind and the one who'd spoken out from Special Forces. And it's just been an ongoing process, with the focus being to better educate the Australian public on who veterans are, better take control of the veteran narrative, because I was pretty much sick of people talking about us. And it's time for us to speak for ourselves. And also to start working with veterans to step ourselves up to start solving some of these problems like we do best. So down and dirty, that's about it.
We're going to circle back to Voice of a Veteran in a moment, but I do have people listening from all over the world. So if they're not necessarily in Australia, can you just kind of dive into what the Brereton report is, what it outlines, which will probably then segue into Voice of a Veteran?
Make sure. Okay. So Brereton is a person. Brereton is a High Court judge from here in Australia. He's also an Army reservist, 2-star general. And he was brought into 4.5 years ago, commence an inquiry, not an investigation, an inquiry into allegations that Special Forces personnel had potentially committed what might be considered war crimes, or at least illegal activities during their time in Afghanistan. So the Australian forces were in Afghanistan, and the Special Forces, as a part of the Special Operations Task Group, were in Afghanistan on and off since 2001. In particular, he was looking from that 2005 period through to about 2016. But the Brereton report specifically captures the period during that time, and of which it took 4.5 years to be completed. Hundreds of people were interviewed. It was very divisive within the veteran community, particularly the Special Forces community, because I, like myself, had to go in there and be asked questions and provide evidence, even just fact-basing stuff. And as soon as you were called forward to provide evidence, you were not allowed to then speak to anyone, even those within your Special Forces fraternity, about what you had been through, what you had said. And particularly within the Special Forces community, which is already very insulated and isolated, just given the operational secrecy requirements, the inability for us to sort of engage within our community and have these rumours spiking around. And to be honest, the way in which the inquiry was conducted, because the rules of evidence didn't apply, was also very divisive in itself. I sat in there twice, and they were interrogations as opposed to questions. And then the report was released into the Australian public November of last year, and it was for the first time we've ever seen in our nation's history where our Prime Minister even stood up before it was released and called it brutal truths, and our Chief of Defence Force stood up and made recommendations to remove honours and awards from 3,000 people, which included 20 dead Special Forces personnel who died overseas on deployments, and basically jumped to all these conclusions without the presumption of innocence, without actual criminal investigations and charges being applied. And a few of us sort of really spoke out against it. And sort of since then, the government really has stepped back, and no honours and awards have been removed and any of that. But we might talk about this later, mate, it's this inflicting moral injury. And that's really been the ramifications across not only the veteran community, but the Australian community, whereby the Defence Force has always been one of those treasured, if not the highest valued institution that is just so pure and authentic in our values, in our culture, in our purpose to serve and protect the Australian people, apolitically, anything. And for the first time, we saw our senior military generals stand up and act like politicians. We saw abandonment of those who have literally gone outside the wire and risked their lives. And at the same time, given the nature of service and even Special Forces service, the inability for people to stand up and actually rebut these in the media outside of, people like myself who have since gotten out. And the response from the Australian people has been huge. We put a petition together. We had 60,000 signatures in 6 days. And the public support for our veterans right now has probably been stronger than ever.
Man, there's so many different things to unpack there, because, obviously these allegations have come from somewhere. But, we need to look at the other side of the story as well. Is like, you guys, the Special Forces community, have been drawn in and essentially interrogated, but what's happening with the other side? Who's telling the other side of the story? It's going to be the families of slain people, who primarily are going to be fucking Taliban forces. Now, this is something that is going to be, this is complex, man. This is a complex subject, and this is why I want to get you on, is because I've been in Afghanistan and I've seen fucking guys shoot at us and then go around the corner, put their weapon away, and now they blend back into the civilian population. And, our rules of engagement dictate that we can't do anything about it, and this has happened multiple times. And, we would essentially capture these guys. We'd get into a tick, troops in contact. We'd capture these guys, didn't have a weapon or anything. We'd take them back to our base for processing. 3 days later, they're back out again, doing the same fucking thing. And some of these guys did kill some of our guys. Some of these guys did, some of our guys did lose limbs and things like that. And we're trying to go through the due process, and, we're being hamstrung by all the fucking red tape.
Yeah, it made us a very complex terrain. And first and foremost, the biggest thing that's been evident and brought out by all of this is the lack of understanding of just exactly what we did in Afghanistan by the Australian people, let alone the complexities, like you're alluding to, mate, of counter-insurgency warfare. Not people lined up on opposing sides of a field in different uniforms, different languages, everything else in between. It's just there's layers and layers of complexity to it, and I'm sort of at the point, mate, where it's just the key part to impart on people is that now in Australia they've set up this federal organisation called the Office of the Special Investigator, which is now tasked to grab the recommendations from the Brereton report and go through an official investigation applying the laws of evidence. And that's going to take years. So even to all the Australian media now, all I say to them is, hey, let's have a chat when the official investigation's been completed, when evidence has been provided, when charges have been laid, and when convictions have been awarded. And until then, everything else is hearsay, and all that you're doing is perpetuating so much angst and emotion in society by, one, realizing that you don't actually even know, let alone value, the service that so many sacrificed and even lost lives or limbs over there for, let alone have taken the time to do your due diligence to better support our community nationally and internationally by preparing the Australian people for this. So there's lots and lots to it. It's been very, very emotive over here, to say the least.
I'm glad I'm in Thailand and not back in Australia. Like, the media has just, it's fuck, man. I don't know how far to go down this path, but last year I was talking to you off air before. Last year, this time of the year, I was actually back in Australia doing my yoga course with a bunch of veterans, and right before I left Thailand, there was talk of the coronavirus and all this type of stuff, and I got back to Australia and it was fucking everywhere, man. You could not escape it. And then I got back to Thailand. I was like, all right, cool. There's not much going on, whatever. And then it was like, the government's going to close everything down. Like, I didn't hear much about it on the media, but that's all I'm hearing back in Australia. I've seen you all over social media recently, essentially defending those who cannot defend themselves because they're still within service and they can't speak up and they can't, they can't have a face, they can't have a voice. But as you said, the media just perpetuates this information based on what?
Well, I used to say this on deployments, mate, and you know this better than anyone, that when the war outside the wire draws more quiet and it comes inside the wire, when people aren't busy with something else, let's even just say purpose outside of self, let alone risk. Risk is the biggest thing that inflates emotion in people. It comes inside the wire, mate. And the best media is media that stirs emotion with people. And not many people are very good at inspiring people in the media. So the easiest thing is to scare them. And that's that's where we're at, mate. And it's just being, it's been incredible being here, mate. And I put this again in the context of mental health and emotional trauma and the sleeping disease that is just now being nested within our society, that is just being dragged over the last 12 months worth of lockdown and scared and outbreak and this. And, we were so stuffed around here in Australia when there was a spike in Sydney, a cluster in Sydney just before Christmas, which shut down the borders and literally disrupted millions of people's plans to reconnect with their families because Queensland had finally opened their borders, which had been closed all year. And you sit there and have the government and these organizations and media talk about, how we need to do this, we need to protect our people. And it's like anyone with military tactics 101 is like, why are we still landing international flights with the highest risk people into our largest populated city being Sydney and then putting them in hotel quarantine in the middle of the city? You can't remove human error. The fact that we're not thinking even tactically not to do that for the entire year, but maybe just not in the month leading up to Christmas and New Year's, just to mitigate some form of human error risk, we're more than happy to almost allow these to occur so as we can see this authoritative and this fear brought back into the place. And you just sit here, mate, trying to look for common sense and look for, as we do, ways in which you can push past and solve these problems and move on. And just when you start seeing the systemic actions to do otherwise. You just sit there going, sweet, when is this over? When can I go to Thailand and join Cobes? Cool.
Yeah, man. I think, the media, it's a tool, right? As with everything, it's a tool. It can be
Yeah.
used. It can be used for positive. It can be used for negative. But I'm reading a book at the moment called Factfulness. Have you read it?
No, I don't read.
Mate, it opens the book with 13 questions. And one of the questions is, for example, in the last 20 years, have the majority of people in poverty doubled, remain the same, or halved? And there's 13 questions like that. What would your answer be for that?
Remain the same.
The answer is halved in the last 20 years. Yeah,
I was
man, but
also going to
all
ask, whereabouts in the world?
in the world, throughout the
Wow.
entire world. Yeah, so the book goes into it goes into data, essentially looking at how the world has changed for the better, but because of the way the media is driven, it is all about sensationalizing information and, again, putting out headlines that are going to draw attention, get clicks and things like that. So for the most part, people think that the world is getting worse, whereas in actual fact, the world is actually probably the safest place to be alive as a human being in humans history.
Yeah.
So, this just goes to show the power of the media, man. Is it's not that the world is, a scarier place. It's a more dangerous place. It's just that we have a lot more access to that information. And the other thing is, like, we're not getting that information that, most of the world's population coming out of poverty has halved in the last 20 years. We're not getting that information because nobody's clicking on that, and there's so many things that, is improving in the world due to science, due to medical advancement, and more countries getting out of poverty and creating more money, creating more jobs, creating better futures, better healthcare systems, better educational systems, and things like that. But we don't hear about that stuff, man. And I think it's crazy man, that we are literally drawn. We are belt fed this information from the media. But the point that I want to make is that we choose what media we consume. We are a product of our environment. So we need to be careful of what we're consuming. We need to be critical thinkers, because all of these companies are using this data, our search engines and things like that, to then push more information towards us. So we end up living in an echo chamber. The information that we're searching for, the information that we're consuming, we're getting pushed more and more of that information. We're not hearing the other side of the story. So I think it's important for people to be critical thinkers and seek out and search for information that opposes their views and their beliefs.
Yeah, it's good. It's a really good point, mate. I mean, first things first, like you said, the media is such a tool, and it was down to me to even realize that and then start harnessing that just to essentially force multiply the message that I needed to get out. And that's where you can apply your training to, basically have people not only like you, but believe in you because you're being authentic about what you're doing. But again, it's just that epiphany that even I've gone through, that ABC report in particular, where they're able to publish a report calling out, a special forces platoon by name for the first time in our history, without actually interviewing any live person and quoting them from an Australian force. It was completely an American guy. And then to literally get in direct contact with the ABC on multiple occasions, emails, calls, a whole bunch of people on my behalf following up and doing so, and them being unwilling to engage with me to even do a follow-up or to even try and get their own facts straight. You're just like, cool. So the purpose is not news and education. The purpose is click and cut through. Got it. And particularly as a veteran, but they released that on the 8th anniversary of the death of Scott Smith, who was my corporal engineer, special operations engineer I lost in Afghan. And it struck a chord, mate. You can imagine that night I was down at the RSL meeting up with his mum, who I hadn't seen in 8 years. And it's just so insulting that they can't even do their due diligence to follow up. And I don't know how to hold the big beast to task. But, even the Brereton report since been released, I'm not under investigation. It just all goes quiet. But I tell you what, there is accountability that has to be made, and we just have to find a way to do it. But it comes down to the consumer to individually make sure that we're doing that. What is it? So what? Make sure you're always questioning what we're seeing. Absolutely, mate, because unfortunately, it comes with its own purpose as opposed to just authentic information.
That's a great point, man. I want to circle back around to Voice of a Veteran. I want to talk about why you've started that. You kind of already touched on it, but let's go a little bit deeper, because it's obviously important to have someone like yourself who is no longer in anymore, but has that experience, has been in the mold, has had your fucking boots on the ground outside the wire overseas, doing what needs to be done, taking the fight to the Taliban. You know, is that kind of why you started Voice of a Veteran, or was it to just become the face and the voice of the people to represent the veterans?
So when I sat here in August of last year and literally started writing out my little death letter and going through visualizing someone like Senator Lambie reading it out to Parliament, it was with the context of, my profile being a retired Special Forces major, so an officer, I've killed plenty of people myself as a platoon. We've gone out there and taken the fight to the enemy and killed and captured many. I've lost, some of my guys. I've done everything from take our Prime Minister over, our first female Prime Minister over on our first trip to Afghanistan, served on exchange for a whole year within the US Special Forces, headed up our contingent for taking the fight to ISIS in Iraq. All these things that look fantastic on paper and the beautiful picture and all this, that, and the other. And I was like, right, finally, this is the profile that is going to achieve the cut through after I kill myself, for people to realize that, shit is wrong. And then I had my moment and I snapped to it. And I sort of looked at this profile that I put down on paper and had this moment where I'm like, well, why am I passing this over to someone else to tell my story? Why am I not using this for the weapon that it can be to fight for good? I, again, was still extremely uncomfortable doing that as myself. So I needed a platform. I needed something that could help me bring a team together. And that was Voice of a Veteran. And that's the whole thing. It's Voice of a Veteran. And I would love nothing more than it to be passed on and moved on to other veterans. And it just needs to be a place to speak out, because that's the biggest thing that I realized is when I was sitting here and all these things were attacking me emotionally, is that I was unable to voice my concern. I was unable to communicate. And it comes from that place where you just spiral into feeling hopeless and in such despair that sort of suicide and ideation comes from. Just literally being able to speak, is so therapeutic and needed that I just needed to harness modern society and technology and social media, and that's it. It was literally just a brand, mate. A brand was born, but it was the confidence that I needed and the purpose that I needed outside of myself to make it happen.
Now, you spoke about suicide there. We both know that that's a massive out for a lot of guys who have previously served, and a lot of guys, do get out of the military and they lose that purpose and that self-identity and, that direction and who they are essentially. And some people don't know how to put those pieces back together, because when you're in the military, you have your purpose, you have your task, you have your mission, you have that environment, though you have those people around you that are all, putting service to others above themselves. Then when you get out of the military, you no longer have that anymore. Talk to me about your transition process and some of the things that you dealt with when you did walk back into the civilian world.
For sure. So I got back from my last deployment to Iraq in early 2017. And at this point in my career, I had pretty much not taken much leave. And I had about 120 days worth of leave in my book. And I also had my long service leave. So I moved myself to America, where I actually, in secret, had a boyfriend that I moved over there and decided to be with him for a while to at least see what that life was like, and which was in Los Angeles, and it was great. And then he was working for a company called Barry's Boot Camp, which at that time was looking for international expansion, and I ended up picking up the rights to partner with a crew over here and bring it here to Australia. So 2018, I moved over here and did it. And it's important to note that even during that 8 to 10 month period, I wasn't contacted by Defence other than someone to try and offer me a deployment to come back. There was no proactive outreach to me, and there was no reactive outreach to me. back, and it was kind of like a just interesting thing in my head to see like how long is it going to take for anyone to sort of check up, because concurrent to this there'd been the murmurs of this veteran mental health crisis that I was completely ignorant to, because particularly within special forces, we were pretty good, and then long story short, all of 2018 did Barry's, and more along my own personal transition, I got immersed in the civilian world, and I was very fortunate jumping straight into leading a brand and expanding it over here. It had its own media, it had its own hype. I was very successful in that area, just project managing. I got to build a whole new company, a whole new team, run selection courses for our trainers, all that good stuff. And then January 2019, I went in to complete my transition paperwork to discharge, and it was about a 2-hour meeting, tick and flick, and I had to come back 2 weeks later and do the same. And I had to do a medical where they just did all these scans of my body, and I'd never put in a single injury and a single downgrade, even though I'd done things like completely rupture my patellar tendon and shoulder and whatever. And then somehow on my file, there was a waiver that said I didn't need a psych screening. So after, 4 trips to Iraq, Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq, and everything else in between, I just walked out, good to go. And then the next year I got involved with regular Sydney social life. I enjoyed myself. I partied hard. I got into some recreational drugs, like nothing crazy, but just the normal stuff. And I drifted more and more away from those values that saw me be my very best, responsible, selfless, and really start to what we do best, immerse myself into my new environment that was very self-gratifying, superficial. I became completely disillusioned with the DBA process because it took me over a year to get doctor's appointments. I had scans on my knee, mate. Like before I left the military, I had this MRI scan on my knee, the knee that I ruptured my tendon. And then it took me 12 months to get that approved so I could then go and see a surgeon. And the surgeon picked up the same scan, the same report I had over a year ago and said, "Hey, has anyone spoken to you about this?" It's like, "No, I've been and seen 3 DBA designated doctors and they put me through range of motion tests and everything." It's like, yeah. So they've looked at all of this from a liability and compensation scope in order to see, what they're liable to do. But if anyone looked at this with your own care and interest at heart, they would have seen, like it's written here, that you have a 2-centimeter fractured bone that is rubbing on everything, and I can remove in a 45-minute procedure and you can run again. And I say that because I know that you could probably really definitely connect with this, that I'd gone from, particularly in special forces, mate, if we had a cough, if we had a shoulder injury, if we had anything, we had hyperbaric chambers, we had our own personal, we were high-performance sport athletes, and we were looked after like nothing else because there's millions of dollars in capability in us. And to realize that I was now no longer even valued enough for a suite of doctors to not think about how can we make this dude happier and healthier and have less pain. It was just this, by this time, mate, my emotional resilience was just so worn down. It hurt and hurt and hurt. And, you just build up such a bad taste in your mouth. And, then you're leading this lifestyle that you're not proud of if your guys back in work started to see, and you don't feel as relevant because the unit moves 400 miles an hour and you jumped off and are trying to catch up to the bus that's still going. So it's just all a big pile of mess in the air, and there's just nothing that really ever fulfills that intrinsic motivation or that purpose that is putting your team, your mission and your country before yourself, and going out there and testing yourself in the ultimate level of training. So yeah, sorry, I went on a ramble there.
No, it's fine, man. That's why I wanted to have a conversation with you, bros. Let's have an open conversation about this, because I think it is an important conversation for people to hear. It's not just you that's going through this. I went through this myself. Most veterans have gone through this, and the interesting thing for me is a lot of people in the last year, in particular, particularly when lockdown started happening. And people lost their jobs and they were stuck at home and they were isolated and they, no longer identified with what they did for work, and they were no longer seeing their friends and family and things like that. That is some people's identity. And when that's taken away from them, that's when mental health issues start arising. And, the interesting thing for me is pretty much all military go from that environment where you're you're sacrificing yourself for a higher purpose. And then when you get out, you kind of, as you said, man, like when you're within the Defense Force, when you're, a high level fucking operator, you're being looked after because you are a capability, and you need to be at your best health so that you can be utilized however and whenever possible to do a task, complete a mission, get the job done. But then when you get out, you're no longer, one of the capabilities, and you're kind of left on your own. And, go and fucking figure this out. Go and figure this out. You're not given any transition process. You're not given any kind of, getting into the army. You go through a basic 3-month fucking course to get in as an OR, and longer for officers, right? But then when you go the other way and transition from the military to becoming a civilian again, there's no process. So, how do you teach? No, that's right, man. Like, you can teach people who walk in off the street, get off the fucking bus, how, 6, 17, 18, 19-year-old kids, shave all their heads, put them in the same fucking clothes, tell them what's right, tell them what's wrong, give them all the rules and regulations, train them up for minimum 3 months, then send them off to their trade schools, then off to, their units. But then when you're getting out, there's no process, man. It was interesting. Like, you spoke about the psychs as well. And when I've told this story before on the podcast, but when I was coming back from Afghanistan, we were based in TK, and, had a 5-day decompression period or whatever, handed back weapon systems, ammunition, body armor, all of our stores and everything like that. Went and saw the doctor, went and saw a psych. And I walked into the psych's office, and the psych was like, "Corporal Koba, take a seat. I know who you are. I know what you've done. I know you've pulled the trigger. I know you've treated your mates, blah, 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 blah. Is there anything that you regret?" And I thought about it, man. I sat with it for about 30 seconds, and I looked at her and I said, "Yes, ma'am, I regret not pulling the trigger more." And she kind of looked at me. She made a little note, and then she goes, "Do you mind elaborating?" And I was like, "Yeah, when we first arrived, we were a little bit hesitant. We wanted to, obviously, we were wary, man. We wanted to make sure we weren't doing anything wrong. We're following rules of engagement, blah, 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 blah." But then that, I guess, tentative behavior allowed the Taliban to fucking get the drop on us sometimes, whereas in other situations, I was like, I wish we had have been more proactive, because I would have this guy's head in my sight picture who's like following the main body. As a sniper, I'm, in the high ground observing, battlefield communications and things like that. And, I had this guy's head in my sight picture. I'm like, this dude's a bad fucking dude. We need to, take this dude out, but couldn't find any weapons. Couldn't see any communications equipment or anything like that. We knew what he was doing. He was fucking spotting, man. He was following our main group, our main body, and he was spotting, man. Anyway, obviously couldn't pull the trigger. A couple of days later, we find out, one of the boys gets fucking hit by, or one of our interpreters steps on IED, shreds his leg, kills him. One of the boys gets fucking hit, cops a heap of shrapnel, gets sent home. And we find out that guy whose head I had in my side picture was the IED facilitator. I was like, we could have fucking taken that dude out prior to it. And that's just one story, man. There's so many stories where that was the case. And I was like, man, fuck, I wish I had have seen something that would allow me to pull that trigger and take that dude out, because not taking that guy out then resulted in Australian casualties, ANA casualties, interpreter casualties, and deaths and things like that, over the coming weeks. And then, sorry, just to go on to that. So I spoke to the psych. Yep, cool, good to go. Got back to Australia. 3 months later, went and did a follow-up. And it was basically like, "Corporal Koba, how you doing?" I was like, "Yep, good, blah, 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 blah." Answered some questions. Told them all the right fucking answers that they wanted to hear, and then walked out. I never got followed up on ever again. And, I've been lucky, man. I don't have PTSD or anxiety or depression or anything like that. But that is simply because I took those skills that I learned as a soldier and I just reapplied them. It took me a little bit of time to kind of float through life and, lose my identity and purpose a little bit. And, I needed that time off after Afghanistan. I got out in 2012. And I kind of needed that time to decompress and travel the world and kind of, like you said, just fucking live my life a little bit. But then once I realized I was just kind of floating, I'd lost my purpose, I'd lost my direction, my structure. I lost my mojo essentially. And once I realized that, I was like, why am I not doing the things that made me such a fucking good soldier? Getting out of bed at a certain time, making my bed, shaving every day, these small daily habits that, had become SOPs, standard operating procedures. And once I noticed that, once I started reestablishing them and just kind of tailoring them for what I want to do with my life, making them specific. I'd already been taught these fucking skills. All I need to do was then repurpose them into the person that I wanted to be, the person that I wanted to become, the direction that I wanted to be moving career-wise, that I realized I was like, hey, man, like, fuck, I've been taught this stuff. Why have I not been using this for the last year and a half?
Amen, mate. That's it. And, so many people as a part of the current veteran transition process and problem and solution paradigm keep looking at, new qualifications, new education, all this. Whereas what I'm really trying to work with the veteran community at the moment is exactly what you said, mate. The soft skills and the ability to define and develop intrinsic and our own extrinsic motivations, the quality of the individual veteran as a member of a workforce, member of a team, member of a culture, member of a society, is actually something that any corporation would spend as much money as they could to instill within the basic building block of capability, which is the humans of their workforce. So it's just, the issue is, mate, it's being able to work with people to help draw the pathways and link their own understanding of their own capabilities. And I was the same. I was like, I don't have a platoon anymore. I don't have a company anymore. I don't have a position to lead and all this. Whereas, mate, I have zero rank. I have zero title. I have zero nothing. But leadership by example is all you need to do. And you're not leading in order to lead. You're leading in order to lead yourself. And you're just doing what needs to be done. And it's really helped me understand and realize, because I became so competent at providing physical courage, that it just wasn't ever something that came into consideration. We're just great at doing what needed to be done, putting ourselves in danger, doing all that. Whereas life outside of service really ever requires physical courage. And that's where we really find ourselves in a place where we don't feel relevant. But what we actually have is the flip side of that, which is moral courage, because we actually have the basic building blocks of personal ethos and values that have led us to absolute greatness, that has caused us to not even fear for our own lives. And that's perspective and experience that some people are never going to have. And it's harnessing that as responsibility to then apply that to really appreciating what matters in life and doing the right thing. Moral courage, you're not going to get killed for it, but still it's one of the hardest things to do. And that's the best way we can lead by example, is just being the best that we can be for the right reasons.
That was very well said, mate. I want to go back to something you said earlier about getting out and you I guess, said that you were suffering in silence and you were kind of on your own. You felt like you didn't have anyone around. You didn't have your team anymore. You were kind of just left to your own devices, as most people are. Now, when you started talking to other people, actually, let's go back. You said you were thinking about committing suicide, and you had this, I guess, light bulb moment where you're like, no, I can use this for a better purpose. When you started talking to people about this stuff and you shared what you went through, did you find that other people were also suffering in silence and had because we're guys, man, we just go, yep, fuck it, I'll deal with this myself. And we don't speak up about shit. Girls are very good at talking to their friends and bouncing ideas off each other. Whereas as guys, we tend to hold shit in and think that we can deal with things ourselves. And when it gets too much, you just pull the pin. And, we know that this has happened way too often in the veteran community. I've lost, many of my mates over the last couple of years, and I'm sure you have as well. But once you started having those conversations with other guys, did you find that they were going through the same thing as well?
Well, that was the fascinating thing, mate. And you can imagine it was a slow and incremental process from my aha moment, where I was all filled with purpose again, through to, 24, 48 hours later, where I was back into my own self-doubt, thinking, you can't do this. You're not big enough. This is much bigger than you. And it was the real thing that actually made me do everything, was then speaking with and reconnecting with a couple of my guys from my platoon, reconnecting with people like Scotty and others, and every single person had the same story, or a version of the story where they doubt themselves and be taken to that place. And so many of those people, the first time they were talking about these stories, I'd had guys that I'd seen at the absolute greatest of, human spectacle in firefights and shit, breaking down, telling me about their situations. And that's why I was like, holy cow, there's something in this. We have to talk about this, and we have to make it okay to talk about this, because it's so therapeutic and cathartic to do it. And the only thing that is literally holding ourselves back is ourselves. So that's where I was able to lead by example and just being vulnerable and authentic, and be able to actually see, and and others help me in just appreciating that we're all human. Obviously I had the huge benefit of the timing of my stuff being 2020, where I think as a culture we had some very rapid evolution for our ability to actually appreciate things like actual mental health and emotional trauma. But yeah, just so fascinating, mate. We just sit there bottled up, and all it takes is literally speaking about this stuff. There's no magic pill. It's communication and connection in that communication.
Yeah, man. I've been, some people reach out to me and they're like, oh, I love your military post. I love your army post, blah, blah, blah. Just explaining my mindset and the things that I've been through that have literally shaped the fucking person that I am today. And I don't write those posts for anybody else. I write them for myself. It's a reminder. It's like, look at the shit you've been through. You can overcome anything. It's reminding myself of the person, everything that's fucking shaped the person that I am today. And if other people can take some benefit from that and they can take some lessons from that, then I'm fucking all about it, man. But again, like you said, it's therapeutic, right? Like it took me, years, probably like 5-6 years before I actually started like openly talking about my military service. And it's not like I put myself into that position and started just like having that conversation with people just because I wanted to have that conversation. It was literally because I moved to Thailand, and the gym that I work in, it's very transient. So there's always people coming and going and blah, blah, blah. And people are like, hey, what brought you over here? And, what's your background and blah, blah, blah. And I just started talking about, my army service. And I found that once I started talking about it, man, I really fucking opened up. And people are like, do you feel like you don't want to talk about it? Like you don't, you hated that experience or whatever. And I was like, no, I actually fucking loved my time in the military. I loved being a fucking soldier. I loved being a sniper, and I loved everything that it taught me. It shaped the man that I am today. But it wasn't until people started asking me questions and showing interest in it that I actually like started lighting up and opening up about that sort of stuff. And again, I felt it was really therapeutic. And, that's why I started doing these military posts and things like that. And people have really gone behind it, and people love it. And they're some of my most popular posts that I put on my social media platform, because people are like, oh, fuck, I never thought about, that perspective. I never thought about some of the things that you went through. I never thought about, the people that are putting on the uniform, that are deploying overseas and, protecting our country's interests.
Because it's not in the media. Yeah, no, you're right, mate. You're right. And it's just, as you say, we too often put, again, others before ourselves, and particularly even in that transition piece out into society, I was the saying, whereby we always think actually about others before ourselves. So even before we embrace these conversations, we actually do our own quick war game that says, hey, this person probably isn't going to be able to connect to this story and might potentially make them feel uncomfortable, so I'm going to avoid it. And I did that for a relationship for 4 years. I did that with all my life, and it got me absolutely nowhere. And it's only actually embracing that, yes, this is a part of me, but this is what I keep putting on the veteran community at the moment. Like, that doesn't entitle you to anything, and your story doesn't define you. It's actually your responsibility, because you have been so privileged, or we have been so privileged to have been able to volunteer. Remember, we volunteered to do this stuff. And the experiences and exposure we've had mean that we actually have more that we need to be contributing to society, and not doing so in a way whereby, yeah, you better fucking respect me and this, that, and the other. But it's more like, nah, you do it for the right reasons. Do it because it needs to be done, not because you want people to take notice of it.
That's a great point. Leadership is not a position or a title. It is your example, your personal example, and your actions.
Yeah, that's it, mate. You can't open up a bottle of leadership. You can't go purchase leadership from the shop. You just know it. You know it when you've got it, and you know when it's toxic. That's for sure.
Yeah, mate. That was something that I struggled with, going from the army to the civilian world. I was kind of lucky because I say lucky, but in reality, I fucking decided to open my own business, because I knew that I didn't want to work for other people. So I went down that path. And, something that I noticed fairly quickly is that, civilians, for the most part, they don't have the same professionalism that you have as a soldier. I mean, you're a high fucking operator, high level skilled operator working in the teams. And I was in a 4-man sniper team, and my fucking team had to have each other's back. And that meant I need to know where my teammates' equipment was. I need to know where their first aid kit was. I need to know where their spare batteries were. I need to know where their tourniquet was. We fucking had to know everything about each other, because when you're out on task, like if something happened, you needed to do whatever was necessary to fucking get the job done and to look after the boys and protect each other. And if you weren't somewhere where you're supposed to be on time, if you weren't keeping your spacing, if you weren't managing your field craft, etc., your basic fucking soldiering skills, man, you become a liability. You increase the risk of being ambushed or, losing your own life or limbs, or, those of your teammates. And the same can't be said about, obviously you don't expect people in the civilian world to understand that, but it was just mind-boggling for me to go from, being in the fucking sniper teams, and then again, going back to that transition process, within 6 weeks of putting in my discharge paperwork, I was on Civvy Street, bro. So I'm walking from these fucking high-level teams, as a highly functioning, highly skilled soldier, back onto Civvy Street, where, just the difference in professionalism and mutual respect and
mate, all those values. And, I go into corporates, mate. I go into corporates and do keynote speaking these days, and people want to talk about combat leadership and all this. And I just say combat leadership's the easiest, because the purpose is very clearly defined. The hardest is career leadership, when you have to actually deal with people's personal ethos and cement them with values and whatnot. And most of these big corporates that I talk to, the COOs, the CEOs, they have never had proper professional leadership training. They have risen to their rank and position through competence in their trade or time in rank. And the average member of the public, mate, hasn't been through the level of training and experience you've had, not for simply the reason that they want to do it, but like you're saying, for critical reasons like you need to do this, or results in loss of life or limb, or even worse for us, loss of respect and reputation with our team, those we actually, brothers by choice and love by choice. So it's so difficult, particularly for someone frog straight out of hot water into the cold water. It's transitioning from high performance at a personal level as well as professional level, not to low performance, mate, but just to normal performance. And I know about you, mate, but I joined straight out of school at 17, and I thought that, those type of people in defence, the people in defence are a representation of society, admittedly with specialist training and whatnot, but to then jump out and see that people's purpose was themselves and work ethic and, teamwork and loyalty. And furthermore, the biggest one, mate, accountability. People are able to shirk accountability left, right, and center. I'm an accountability Nazi. Like, if you say you're going to do something, I will hold you to a standard, because I want you to hold that to me as well. And that's just even the biggest part, mate, that we could immediately 101 help fix this transition piece, is people like yourself and myself going and talking to those who are currently serving or those who are thinking about transitioning, saying, hey, you need to set your mindset now that you think differently, you perform differently, you act differently. However, that doesn't mean that you need to forget that. That is actually an aspirational level that you want to try and bring across, but you need to understand that you need to bring people along with you. You're already at a higher level of operating baseline because you've been trained that way. So start conditioning your mindset now. And even better, mate, more exposure while you're in service to what life is like out of service is actually the real and proper thing we need to do, learning by actually doing. But it's fascinating, because I was the same, mate. I was jumping straight into working on building studios and doing things like this, and, timelines and deadlines and budgets, and everything's blown out. And you're just sitting there going, how are you employed? And then I'm the bad guy for holding people accountable. It's crazy.
Yeah, man. It's Mate, it's a difficult process, but I think a little bit more needs to be done on that transition because once you sign that dotted line to get out, it's like, oh, and the funny thing for me is, going back to my transition process, I filled out my paperwork, I got everything ticked off, I ticked all the boxes, and I got called into the CEO's office, and I walked into the CEO's office. Um, had a quick conversation with him, and he was like, all right, cool, what are you doing with your life? And I was like, oh, I'm going to do this and that and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, all right, cool, thank you for your service, all the best. And I walked back down to the offices. I walked down the hangars, man, and one of the boys comes up and he's like, what'd the CEO say? And I was like, oh, he just wished me all the best. And he's like, my mate was like, that's fucking bullshit. You're one of the most respected, like highly decorated soldiers in the battalion. They're just going to let you walk out of here. They're not going to fucking put up a fight and try and, keep you around to pass on this information to, the next bunch of leaders or whatever, man. And I was just like, I was actually glad that, didn't try and fuck me around and keep me in. But then you see other guys that, are trying to get out, that get fucked around, man. They lose their discharge paperwork and it takes 6 months, it takes a year. And then there's other guys that they like highly qualified soldiers, good dudes that you want in your battalion to pass on the experience, knowledge, information to, the next bunch of soldiers coming through. They let those guys walk out really fucking easy because they were good soldiers. They're like, oh, they'll be fine. They'll be fine in normal life. But then you got the pieces of shit that didn't have their shit together, that were just a fucking pain in the ass for everyone that dealt with them, and the battalions would just hold on to those guys and make it difficult for them to get out. It was crazy, man. I was like, this weird fucking dichotomy. I was like, you're letting the good guys walk out the door and you're holding on to the shit dudes. It's like, what sort of a culture are you creating?
I don't know. I personally never got to see a lot of that. But one little point that I really did pick up on was just the lack of no engagement with those people once they're gone. Like, you'd think thered be some, we learn the best when we actually have like a mentor, when we have someone like we can look up to, or we can like at least envision our own personal glide path in some form of a pattern or trajectory in that direction. And then, not even having anyone check up on you in the first year, the second year, like the first month, hey man, like what have you learned? Like, but you can imagine, mate, you stand up a capability which is meant to be this joint transition authority that they've stood up here in Australia and be like, hey, your task is to like effectively transition people. First and foremost, it has to come from people who've already transitioned. I know if you asked Major Heston Russell of 2017 to do this transition program, I would have been like, right, we need to do this, this, and this. And then Heston Russell right now is like, hell, you're so wrong. Like, you have to have literally walked that path because it is life. But yeah, I just can't believe it. And this is what it comes back to, is even helping people better understand that in defense, while there's plenty of those around who do care who you are, what it actually comes down to is what you can do. It really comes down to what you can provide and what you can do. And when you can no longer provide, or you choose that you're no longer going to do that, then sorry, you're a good guy, but we don't need you. And it's hard to move on from that, mate. But honestly, just even if someone had said that to me, hey, you're probably not going to hear from defense. We need to move on. We've got to do this. It's for the first time where you really start to get that emotional injury, and that's where entitlement starts to creep in. When you don't feel like you're being treated the way you're entitled to, you don't feel like you're actually getting a fair go. You don't feel like your service is worth anything. That's where resentment builds and entitlement festers into your own sort of toxic personal culture.
There's an interesting point there. When you're in, your identity is what you do for a job and how good of a soldier you are. That's an
Capability.
Yeah, man, that's an interesting point, because when you discharge, that is no longer your identity. You can no longer say you're a major in, in special forces. I can no longer say I'm a sniper. Like, your identity just goes up in smoke.
Yeah. So it's like, I was like, cool, man. I'm like, what are you today? I was like, I'm a veteran. Cool.
Yeah.
What are you doing with that? Good question. I'm trying to figure that out. Yeah.
Yeah, man. That's interesting. That's interesting. Mate, I want to go back to, you mentioned earlier that you had a boyfriend. Now, I can imagine being special forces and having that come out would have sent some shockwaves. Like, when did that come out? Talk to me about that process, how people reacted to it, and kind of what your how those events unfolded when you did come out.
Yeah, so I never came out. I sort of even have this thing, even in hindsight, mate. I kept myself in the closet my whole adulthood because I wasn't comfortable with being gay. I thought that I could shake it. I thought it was a phase. You know, end of 2014, I got sent over to the US for a year on exchange with their special forces. So that was all of 2015. So I turned 30. I actually turned 30 in Afghanistan with those US forces. And I had set myself the task at this stage to find myself a beautiful American girlfriend whose father had an oil field in Texas or something. And, I was going to do, the stereotypical model. I was then to be promoted on major back to Australia, and within two commando and within special forces, to my knowledge at that time, there was no openly gay male operator. And for me to then be, essentially the second highest rank in the units as a major and be the first person to be that, I wasn't ready for that, because I, again, kind of what I was saying beforehand, thought that that would define me, and essentially allowed myself to think that that was going to be the definition of me. And I didn't want anyone to think anything of me apart from my competence and character each and every day. And we have this saying, when you get your beret, it's a daily renewable contract. Your beret is your daily renewable contract. You need to earn it and justify that you have it and the responsibility to wield it every single day. And to think that someone was going to potentially look at me with a label as being gay or a homosexual and think that that was going to impact my personal professional performance in any way was literally a nightmare to me. So, even that deployment to Iraq, I'd been with my boyfriend then for 18 months long distance. He was in LA, and I stepped off early 2017. And, gradually during that time, I probably got a little bit more relaxed on my social media. But it was during that time that I told my sister, I told my mother. My time in the US, I actually got to see professional gay men. Like, I went to dinner with a Disney producer. I met, one of the founders of PayPal, and I didn't even know these people were gay, whereas I lived from like a very Sydney stereotypical sort of feminine, masculine contrast. And when I finally became comfortable, I never again came out. It's just when people started to ask me if I was gay, I would say yes. And you know what, mate? About 3 or 4 people actually asked me that, and most of them had to have half a skin full of liquor to do so. And the most incredible part was, and particularly a lot of my old platoon, I really then at that point felt horrified that they would have thought that I was holding something from them, that I'd been dishonest to them. And it really was, my biggest fear was actually them thinking that I didn't trust them enough to know who I was. But it was actually me who had to trust myself and become comfortable with myself. And every single person that I've ever spoken to, I'm still yet to find a bad one, has said, dude, like, why didn't you tell us? They immediately empathize, like, that must have been like crazy trying to hold that in. It's like, well, no, it wasn't. It just wasn't a factor for me. Every now and then there'd be those moments, but I was so dedicated to my job. And it's fascinating for me to look back. And this is where I said earlier in this podcast, mate, realizing that too often you are the only person holding yourself back. And I now look back with the regret that I didn't have the confidence in myself to acknowledge that that was me, not a weakness. Because you can imagine, mate, even if you're applying 2% of your effort to potentially suppress that, that's 2% of your effort you could have been putting into what you were doing. And particularly when we start talking about physical, mental, and emotional alignment, I just literally did not allow myself to have emotions my entire career unless they were for my soldiers, as you can imagine. And that was actually a huge part of my transition, mate, is that I allowed myself to be in love. I allowed myself to feel emotion. And I first felt those emotions as a 32, 33-year-old man, and I was not good at it. I allowed those emotions to overtake me. I lived my life for those emotions. That pendulum swung hardcore. I basically finally embraced teenage emotions as a middle-aged man, and That's part of like my lesson. Anyone listening or hearing it on this is, I have great emotional intelligence and the ability to perceive and influence others, and physical and mental resilience, but I was not mature emotionally, and it was fascinating to even just learn that about myself.
That's crazy, man. That's an awesome reflection, dude. Thank you very much for sharing that. I really appreciate it.
It's the
You
first time
did talk earlier about. I'm sorry, you broke
right.
up then.
So that's the first time I've probably actually been able to put that together. So again, thanks for this mental fitness session, mate. It's good to go.
Oh, mate, you're coaching me as much as I'm coaching you. I love these conversations, bro.
I agree.
Um, Mate, what I want to go back to is you spoke about mentors earlier. Have you had any amazing, outstanding mentors in your life in different areas, whether that's within the military, guys that you really look up to, that you want to emulate, people within your civilian life, just anywhere in your life? Like, who are the people that you look up to that you want to emulate and you want to take some traits that they have?
Mate, I have really struggled in this, and this has actually been something that's really weighed on my head, where I never, what so many other people like have clear and defined mentors, and there's always been, I guess, probably a part of that whole like personal uncertainty is I really probably close myself off to allowing myself to be inspired by others. I've always been inspired. To be honest, mate, I've always drawn the largest amount of inspiration by those I've been responsible for. I operate that way, and I honestly butted heads too much with the people above me because I thought that I was better at supporting my guys and the mission, and they were just being lazy. But in hindsight, mate, my father, who was in the military before me, really was a key role model for me without even knowing it, a key mentor. He got in and served. He started off as a digger, became a bombardier, then became an officer. And he served 20 years during, the Great Peace. In his 20 years, he did one deployment to Butterworth, where he got his ASM, his Australian Service Medal, no warlike service. Then he got out, and he got back in about 10 years later. And next thing, he was off to, when I was at ADFA in 2003, he was off to Iraq as a part of the first push to, rid Saddam. And he did another trip to Iraq with British strikers. And then he was off to Afghanistan. And, in that 7 or 8 year period, he did, multiple combat deployments. But when he got out after his 20 years, he got out as a major, he got out with his pension. And when he got back in, he was never going to be promoted again. And throughout my 16 years in my career, you couldn't help but run into people who work with my dad. And his reputation that he had was just, he was good at his job and he was a good person. Like, he's an absolute workhorse, and everyone had the most amount of respect for him because there was not a single ounce of him that was ever looking to progress his own career. He was just, and you can imagine, mate, particularly after he'd had his first trip to Iraq, he, as a 50-year-old man, was finally like completed as what he signed up to do. And it was just so fascinating, really understanding that where you can find true happiness in authentic purpose, not being yourself, but being the mission, the men, the task. And his catchphrase, be good at your job, be a good person, that was huge. And within the military, I never really had a lot of role models because there were, or mentors, because there were a few that I had, and then they ended up letting me down, to be honest, mate. But then in personal life, I have to say, my mum and my sister, um, as far as being, and I go back to that emotional immaturity piece, as far as being my emotional rocks, from being when I lost Scott Smith in Afghan in 2012, and I came back after 3 days of that mission, I went into my room in Camp Russell in TK, and I pulled the phone to my office and I bawled my eyes out like a baby to my mother and told her that I lost one of my guys. It was like really emotionally traumatic for me, but I had my cry to my mum. My mum listened, and my mum, you could just imagine what that's like for a mother on the other side of the world hearing that, but more happy that I was okay. And then I was done. I got to pour out that emotional box, and next thing I put the phone back and I was straight back into it. And same for my sister. She's always been that one person to keep me level-headed. And, she was the first person I told that I was gay, and her response was, as long as it's not illegal and you're not hurting anyone, you do what you want, honey. I was like, okay. This is my younger sister. Absolutely hilarious. And particularly I think as a man, drawing that inspiration from women where there is authentically no competition at that tribal level we tend to have. I'm happy to say that, ladies have always had a pretty leading edge in my life. And my mum started off as an aerobics instructor. And then when I went to ADFA, her and dad had divorced by then, and she was working in a bottle shop and doing her aerobics instructing. And at, I don't know, she was 40 something, she decided to take herself to university and become a registered nurse, and really break from the trend and really push herself out. And she said me going to ADFA inspired her to do that. So I guess I've never really looked to someone at where I want to go to. I really want to focus on how I'm doing what I'm doing and really open myself up to draw inspiration from those in and around me. And that's been a really difficult thing, particularly to remove that competitive lens and open yourself up to appreciating, physically aspirationally, mentally aspirationally, emotionally aspirationally, but also just that support structure you put around you. Sorry, that's a very roundabout way of answering your question.
No, that was brilliant, man. Loved it.
Cool.
That leads me to my next question. How do you define success?
How you do what you do will define the success of the future you. That's my little riddle. Success for me, mate, is being good at my job and being a good person and appreciating that success can be reached every single day, just as failure can be. And I don't know where that ends. I just know that I need to apply myself into everything that I do that needs to be done. And success for me at the current moment is making sure that every capital city in Australia effectively commemorates Anzac Day this year and pulls their finger out and does what needs to be done, because it's all about much more than a physical parade. It's about our people, our hearts, our minds, and our souls of our nation at the moment. Through to success for me over this next year, as potentially Australia approaches an election, is to make sure that not only the voices of our people, our veterans, and our Australians who need to be heard are heard, but our nation moves forward on a renewed purpose that better takes account of the mental and emotional aspects of our people, because too often we're focusing on the physical and the financial. I don't know how that's going to happen. I just know what, I think needs to occur. So, mate, if I can check back in with me towards the end of the year and hold me accountable and talk to me and play this back to me, and let's see where success and failure have come along that route.
I shall do that, mate. You create your own success. To wind up, mate, the last question that I want to ask is, the name of this podcast is Live, Train, Perform, which stands for live life to the fullest, train to your potential, and perform at your best. What does that mantra mean to you?
Oh, it means that mediocrity has to die a slow and painful death, and very quickly. And for me, mate, it's kind of, the word commando for me means so much, because it's, not bound by or conforming to convention, precedent, or rule. And it's being that daily renewable contract, being ready for anything. And the last 18 months of my career before Iraq, I ran and remodeled our commando selection course and training continuum. And it was all about selecting the right person that we could then train to do anything. And live, train, perform, has to be that, mate. You can't just turn up and expect things to happen. You need to live a life that best supports everything you need to train and prepare yourself for, because when the game comes, you have what you have there and then in physical, mental, and emotional strength to put it all on the table and put it to the test, and you just can't backtrack from there. So that's what that means to me.
Love it, bro. If people want to support Voice of a Veteran and yourself and the mission that you're on at the moment, where can they find you?
For sure. Even just want to find out more, voiceofaveteran.org is the website, and it all goes from there. And then myself, Heston Russell, Heston, on social media. And yeah, just get on there and have a look. It's a pretty open, transparent book these days, but always willing to engage with anyone who can. There's plenty of ways, particularly on the Voice of the Veteran website, to do that, or just the old sneaky DM works just as well.
Slide in those DMs, people. You guys also have a podcast as well, you and Scotty Evernet, who is a former 2 Commando guy as well, who's been in the fitness industry for a while since he discharged. I've been listening to you guys for the last few days, just catching up on everything that's going on with Voice of a Veteran in preparation for this conversation. So I'll have all of those links in the show notes. Heston, it's been an absolute pleasure having a chat to you, mate. Thank you very much for sharing your journey, sharing your story, and sharing your emotions with myself and my audience.
Sean, mate, Cobes, thank you so much, dude. Like I said, I was feeling like pretty flat coming into this. As I said beforehand, it's been a long day, but even just having these conversations, mate, you've helped to like connect so many of these pathways that obviously need to be connected. So thanks so much for, one, giving me the chance to do it, and two, mate, creating the space for this communication and connection to occur, because as we spoke about previously, this actually is the shit that helps people. So thank you for helping me and helping those who are listening and drawing from this.
Amazing, mate. Great conversation. Thank you very much, brother.
Well, see you, mate.
And there you have it, guys, my interview with Heston Russell. I really enjoyed this conversation. If you did as well, please make sure you pass it off to your friends and family, anyone that you believe can benefit from these conversations, and any 5-star ratings and reviews are much appreciated. Much love, guys. Peace.